Gerald's fingers tightened on the check, his smirk curling like a blade. This, this isn't real, he said, before tearing it straight down the middle, the sound ripping through the marble silence like a gunshot. Marcia froze, the sting of humiliation rising hot in her chest. Around her, customers stared, some wide-eyed, others averting their gaze. But then, through the glass wall behind him, a tarp slid away outside, revealing a towering billboard with her son's face smiling proudly beside the bank's logo. The air shifted. If you think that's the moment everything changed, you need to hear the rest. Drop your thoughts in the comments if you feel this injustice.
Your
Marcia
arrogance won't
Taylor
change the facts,
pushed
Gerald.
open the gleaming
That's too much
glass
fun,
doors of
Marcia. It's all about
Peachtree Bank.
presentation.
Mr. Hughes,
The
Miss
air
Taylor, please.
inside, crisp
Your
and
arrogance
cool,
won't change the facts,
compared to
Gerald.
the late
Facts
summer
can be
heat
fun, Marcia.
on
It's all
Atlanta's
about
busy
presentation.
streets.
Mr. Hughes, Miss Taylor,
She had
please.
chosen this branch intentionally, thinking it would be a simple stop in her day, a quick deposit before meeting a friend for lunch. She wasn't in her usual tailored suit. Today, she wore a simple blue blouse and tan slacks. It was her rare personal day, and she looked forward to blending in, just another customer going about her errands. However, the first few moments already told her this wouldn't be that kind of visit. The bank's marble floors reflected the ornate brass light fixtures above, and dark wood paneling lined the walls, all meant to project an image of stability and prestige. But Marcia's trained eye noticed something else, something subtle but unmistakable. White customers were greeted with quick smiles and ushered to tellers within minutes, while the few customers of color waited significantly longer, even when windows stood open. As a woman who had spent years consulting on equity and community development, she could read the patterns like a familiar book. She took her place in the line for deposits, holding a crisp $50,000 check in her hand. The money was payment for a series of financial literacy workshops she had led in underserved neighborhoods, ironically funded by the bank's own community outreach program. Her fingers traced the embossed print on the check, not out of doubt, but out of quiet pride in the work it represented. However, after 20 minutes of waiting, while others who arrived later were waved ahead, she began to feel that uncomfortable edge of being noticed, yet ignored. Finally, she was called forward, but before she could reach an available teller, a man in a tailored gray suit stepped directly into her path. His nameplate read, Gerald Hughes, branch supervisor. He wore a smile that seemed more rehearsed than warm, his eyes sweeping over her as though cataloging her appearance. I'll handle this personally, he said, his tone suggesting he was doing her a favor. He gestured toward his station, stopping just short of touching her elbow. Gerald took the check between two fingers, holding it as though it might soil his manicured hands. This is quite a large sum, he remarked, lifting it to the light with theatrical precision. Nearby, a white businessman in an off-the-rack suit deposited a similar amount without a single question. Marcia noticed, and her voice remained calm but firm when she pointed it out. The gentleman beside me is depositing a similar check without these questions. Gerald didn't flinch. Every situation is different, he replied, his tone dismissive. However, his questions became more pointed. He examined her ID and business card briefly before flipping the check over, again and again, as if expecting to find something hidden in the paper fibers. This kind of amount is unusual for a personal check, he said, emphasizing the word personal with a pause that carried a heavy implication. Marcia explained evenly that it was a business payment, but his skepticism didn't fade. In his mind, risk and bias were intertwined so tightly that he could not see where one ended and the other began. Outside the bank's glass wall, maintenance workers began pulling down a heavy tarp, revealing part of a massive billboard. Marcia barely registered it. Gerald certainly didn't. His focus was on her and the decision he was about to make. Finally, with an air of finality, he placed the check on the counter and in one deliberate motion tore it cleanly in half. The rip echoed sharply through the hushed lobby, drawing startled gasps from nearby customers. But Gerald wasn't done. He folded the pieces and tore them again until the fragments lay in small piles between them. "I'm sorry, but I cannot accept this," he said with bureaucratic detachment. "It appears fraudulent." Gasps and whispers rippled through the lobby. One woman murmured, "Is that even legal?" Marcia's expression didn't waver. Years of boardroom battles had taught her the power of controlled composure. "May I have documentation of your refusal and the specific reason for destroying a financial instrument without verification?" she asked. The measured tone of her voice made the question feel heavier. Gerald's smile faltered for the first time. "We don't provide documentation for fraudulent items," he replied, painting himself into a corner. She carefully placed the torn check into her purse, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. In the corner of her eye, she noticed the billboard outside was now fully uncovered. But she stayed seated, her mind already moving to next steps. She knew this was bigger than one torn check. This was about the quiet ways bias wrapped itself in policy, the small humiliations that built into systemic injustice. And as she glanced back at Gerald Hughes, still wearing that thin veneer of authority, she knew this encounter was only the beginning. She wouldn't be leaving the bank defeated. This time, the story wouldn't end here. The atmosphere in Peachtree Bank shifted the moment Gerald Hughes tore up Marcia Taylor's check. What had begun as quiet whispers among customers now became an unspoken but palpable focus on the corner where she sat. She had moved away from his counter, not to leave, but to occupy a small leather armchair near the center of the lobby. From there, she could see both the entrance and Gerald's station. Her posture was calm, but her presence was intentional, rooted in a patience that felt heavier than silence. Tellers continued their transactions, though their eyes often flicked toward her. A young teller, Amanda kept shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling, clearly aware something unusual had just happened. Gerald, meanwhile, sat at his station, typing furiously, as though composing the final word on the matter. In reality, he was documenting what he considered a successful prevention of a fraudulent transaction, a phrase he had used before in other reports. To him, this was routine, another day, protecting the bank from risk. However, Marcia understood risk differently. In the financial world, risk often becomes a slippery term, one that, when left undefined, can mask bias. For example, the idea that someone doesn't look like they should have a certain amount of money is not a formal risk assessment. It's a stereotype cloaked in professional language. She knew this, and she knew she had just experienced it in its purest form. Her phone buzzed. A text from her son Jamal. They just unveiled the billboard. "Did you see it yet?" She didn't respond. Not yet. Outside, she could see part of the towering image, Jamal's confident smile in his Atlanta Hawks jersey. the Peachtree Bank logo beside him. Irony had rarely felt this sharp. Gerald's phone rang the display, showing Regional HQ, but he silenced it without looking up. His focus was on maintaining the narrative he'd decided on from the moment Marcia approached his counter. This wasn't just stubbornness. It was about protecting his authority. Admitting a mistake, especially in front of customers, would chip away at the image he projected daily. A few minutes later, Amanda approached Marcia cautiously. Her voice rehearsed, but tinged with genuine concern. "Ma'am, is there something else we can help you with today?" It was clear Gerald had sent her to nudge Marcia toward the exit. "Yes," Marcia replied evenly. "I'd like to speak with whoever maintains your Community Reinvestment Act compliance documentation." Amanda blinked, caught off guard. Most customers didn't even know the CRA existed, let alone request its files. The act required banks to demonstrate they served the credit needs of all communities, including low and moderate income neighborhoods. By law, each branch had to keep certain documents available for public inspection. Gerald was at her side before Amanda could respond. "We don't provide that information to customers," he said firmly, dismissing the teller with a sharp glance. "Actually," Marcia said, her tone, still even Regulation BB specifically requires it. Section 228.43. Every branch must maintain its own file. She turned her tablet toward him, the official FDIC page open with the clause highlighted. The shift in Gerald's expression was subtle but telling. He didn't like being challenged on specifics, especially not by someone he'd already decided wasn't worth his professional respect. "Our system is down for maintenance," he said smoothly. "Perhaps you can come back another day." "I've cleared my afternoon," Marcia replied. "I'll wait." She adjusted in her seat, a clear message that this was not a passing whim. Minutes turned into a quiet stalemate. Customers continued their transactions, but a tension lingered in the air, as if the whole room was waiting for something to happen. Gerald's phone rang again. Regional HQ once more, but he silenced it without breaking eye contact with his screen. Then the lobby doors opened, and a courier stepped inside holding an envelope marked Urgent, Executive Division. He handed it to Amanda, who carried it straight to Gerald. The supervisor tore it open, his eyes scanning the contents. It was a formal request for immediate verification of all transactions denied in the past 30 days, along with demographic data. The timing was far too close to coincidence. Gerald's gaze lifted toward Marcia, suspicion and unease mingling for the first time. He walked over, forcing a thin smile. "Perhaps there was a misunderstanding earlier," he began. "If you'd like to step into my office, we can discuss reissuing your check." "I prefer to conduct this publicly," Marcia said, "just as my humiliation was public." Heads turned. The atmosphere became charged, as though the marble and brass walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Gerald's phone rang a third time. This time, he answered, his voice confident at first, then faltering as the caller spoke. His eyes kept darting toward Marcia. When he hung up, his tone was noticeably different. "Ms. Taylor, it appears your check was valid after all. And yet you destroyed it without verification." Marcia replied, her voice calm but cutting. Before he could respond, the doors opened again. This time the regional director entered, flanked by the head of human resources and the bank's diversity officer. The room stilled instantly. Diane Phillips, the director, walked straight to Marcia. "I came as soon as I received your documentation," she said, her tone respectful. Then she turned to Gerald. "Mr. Hughes, your presence is required in the conference room immediately." Gerald froze, the weight of realization settling on him. The woman he'd dismissed wasn't just another customer. She was someone whose voice carried authority well beyond these marble halls. As he followed Diane toward the back offices, every step echoed with the collapse of the certainty he'd relied on for years. Marcia remained in her seat, not triumphant, but resolute. This was no longer about one torn check. It was about exposing a system that allowed moments like this to happen at all. She knew the real battle was just beginning. Outside the tall glass facade of Peachtree Bank, the late morning sun broke through a thin veil of clouds, casting a clean light across the street. Maintenance workers had been at it for nearly an hour, dismantling the last of the temporary covering on the massive digital billboard that towered over the intersection. From where she sat in the lobby, Marcia Taylor had caught glimpses of movement and color through the window, but her attention remained fixed on the charged silence inside. Then, without fanfare, the final length of tarp dropped away. A sudden wash of color burst into view, sharp, vivid, and impossible to miss. Against a backdrop of the Atlanta skyline, a larger-than-life image, appeared a young man mid-stride on a basketball court, sweat glistening on his forehead, his expression focused and proud. Across the top, bold white letters spelled out, "Investing in our future." To the right, in perfect clarity, was the logo of Peachtree Bank. It was Jamal Taylor, her son. The reaction inside the bank was subtle at first, a shift in the air the way conversation faltered mid-sentence. A middle-aged man in line craned his neck toward the window. A teller glanced from the screen of her computer to the massive image outside and back again, eyes narrowing in recognition. Someone whispered, "Isn't that the Hawks player?" However, Gerald Hughes remained hunched over his desk, his focus still on the stack of papers in front of him. He hadn't looked outside yet. He was too busy composing his own version of events in his report, shaping the narrative in which he was the vigilant gatekeeper protecting the bank's integrity. Marcia shifted slightly in her seat, turning just enough to see the full billboard through the glass. Her chest tightened not with surprise, but with a complex mix of pride and the bitter irony of the moment. She had watched Jamal's rise from local leagues to the NBA, each step a product of his relentless work ethic. Now, here he was, the face of the very institution whose representative had just shredded her credibility along with her check. It didn't take long for the dots to connect among those in the lobby. A woman near the door, clutching a stack of deposit slips, leaned toward her neighbor and asked, "That's her son, isn't it?" The other nodded slowly, her gaze sliding toward Marcia. Recognition spread like a ripple through water. Eyes began to turn, not with pity now, but with curiosity and a dawning sense of discomfort about what they had just witnessed. Finally, Gerald's head lifted, irritation etched across his face as the buzz of whispers reached him. He followed the direction of the stairs, glancing toward the window almost absently. Then his gaze locked on the billboard. His posture stiffened. The image of Jamal filled his field of vision, the Peachtree Bank logo planted firmly beside him like a seal of approval. It took a beat before Gerald's eyes darted back to Marcia, then to the billboard again, the connection visibly clicking into place. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The realization was almost physical, a weight settling on his shoulders, the recognition that he had not just insulted any customer, but the mother of the bank's high-profile community partner. The marketing team had poured millions into aligning the bank's image with Jamal's story of perseverance, leadership, and giving back. And Gerald had just undermined that narrative in front of a live audience. The regional director, Diane Phillips, chose that moment to step forward. She had arrived minutes earlier, but had lingered near the entrance, watching events unfold. Now, with the billboard fully revealed and the room's attention squarely on Marcia, she crossed the marble floor with measured steps. "Ms. Taylor," she said warmly, extending her hand. "It's good to finally meet you in person. We've admired your work in the community for a long time." Gerald blinked rapidly, as if trying to reframe the scene in his head. "You know each other?" he asked, his voice strained. "Of course," Diane replied without looking at him. "Ms. Taylor has been advising our national office on community investment strategies for the past 2 years. She's the reason we partnered with Jamal on the Investing in Our Future campaign." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The whispers in the lobby swelled again, but this time with an edge of disbelief. Gerald's authority, so absolute moments ago, was evaporating in real time. Marcia met his gaze, her expression composed. "Funny, isn't it?" she said quietly enough for only him to hear. "You didn't see the person in front of you until you saw her reflection on the side of a building." He swallowed hard, the retort dying in his throat. It was a truth too pointed to deflect. Outside the billboard cycled through its campaign images, Jamal running a youth clinic, visiting a local school, speaking at a charity event. Each frame was a testament to values the bank claimed to uphold: opportunity, fairness, community. Inside, the contrast between those glossy ideals and the reality of the morning's events was impossible to ignore. The moment held. Customers shifted uncomfortably. Tellers pretended to focus on their screens, and Gerald stood frozen between the life-size face of Jamal outside and the very real presence of Marcia inside. The space between them was now filled with the weight of everything unspoken, the damage done, the hypocrisy revealed, and the power balance tilting in ways Gerald could no longer control. Marcia didn't need to raise her voice. The billboard had already done the talking for her. The shift in the room was undeniable. Moments earlier, Gerald Hughes had been the unquestioned authority in the marble halls of Peachtree Bank. Now, with the image of Jamal Taylor towering over the street outside and the regional director standing at Marcia Taylor's side, the narrative had begun to unravel. Yet Marcia knew that moments like this, while satisfying, were not enough on their own. Humiliation without reform was just spectacle. Diane Phillips wasted no time. "We're moving to the conference room," she said, her tone firm but measured. Gerald hesitated, glancing toward the small audience that had formed in the lobby, but Diane's raised eyebrow left no room for negotiation. Marcia rose slowly, not as a defeated customer being summoned to a back office, but as someone who had been invited to a table where decisions were made. Inside the glass-walled conference room, the atmosphere was taut. Gerald took a seat across from Marcia. His usual air of control, reduced to clipped nods and restless hands. Alongside Diane sat the bank's head of human resources and its diversity and inclusion officer, a younger man named Andre Coleman, who had clearly heard pieces of the incident already. Diane began, "We need to address what happened here today fully and transparently." Her eyes moved to Gerald. "Explain your actions." Gerald cleared his throat, clinging to procedural language like a life raft. The transaction appeared inconsistent with standard account activity. I acted in the bank's best interest to prevent potential fraud. Marcia listened without interrupting. She had heard variations of this defense before, how policy was often used as armor for prejudice. When he finished, she leaned forward slightly. "The best interest of the bank," she said softly, "cannot be separated from the best interest of the community it serves. If your policies only protect the bank from certain people, then they're not protection. They're exclusion." Her words were steady, but each landed with precision. Andre nodded, subtly scribbling notes. Diane asked, "What outcome do you believe would repair this situation?" Ms. Taylor Marcia could have demanded Gerald's dismissal right then. It would have been swift justice in the eyes of those watching. But she understood that removing one person did not remove the bias that trained him. "I'm less interested in one person's punishment than I am in ensuring this never happens to anyone else," she replied. "That requires structural change, not just a personnel file entry." She outlined her proposal, a mandatory training program addressing implicit bias for all employees, from tellers to executives, with annual refreshers tied directly to performance reviews. She recommended that transaction denials be logged with specific reviewable criteria, and that each branch's data be audited quarterly for patterns that might reveal inequitable treatment. However, she didn't stop at internal measures. "Trust is rebuilt in the open," she said. "The community needs to know that this bank acknowledges the harm and is taking action. That means public accountability, a statement, and a commitment to measurable goals." Gerald shifted in his chair, his discomfort visible. "We can't make every internal process public," he muttered. Marcia met his eyes evenly. "Transparency isn't weakness. It's how you prove your values aren't just words on a billboard." The irony of the phrase hung in the air, unspoken, but unmistakable. Diane glanced at Andre, who said, "We can implement a pilot program within 60 days. We've been discussing something similar, but this incident makes it urgent." Outside the conference room, the lobby was no longer quiet. Word of the confrontation had reached beyond the customers who witnessed it firsthand. A local journalist had arrived, tipped off by someone in the bank. Through the glass, Marcia could see her speaking with the security guard, gesturing toward the billboard outside. Diane noticed too. "This will be public by tonight," she said almost to herself. Then she turned back to Marcia. "We'll move on this immediately, and I'd like your continued involvement as an advisor to the rollout." Marcia inclined her head, the faintest smile touching her lips. "I'll hold you to that." The meeting ended with a plan in motion. Gerald was placed on administrative leave pending review. The compliance department was instructed to begin an immediate audit, and the bank's communications team was tasked with drafting a public statement before the close of business. But for Marcia, the real victory was not the temporary removal of a single supervisor. It was that the institution's leadership had been compelled to confront the gap between their public image and their actual practices. As she stepped back into the lobby, she was met with a mix of curious stares and nods of respect. Amanda, the young teller who had first approached her, caught her eye. "Thank you," she whispered so quietly that only Marcia could hear. Marcia paused near the exit, looking once more at the towering image of her son outside. The words beneath his face. Investing in our future suddenly felt heavier, like a promise that demanded to be kept. She pushed open the glass doors, the late afternoon light spilling across the sidewalk. The humiliation of the morning had been real, but it had become something else entirely, a catalyst. And in Marcia's hands, catalysts always sparked change. 6 months later, Peachtree Bank's Midtown branch no longer felt like the same place where Marcia Taylor had walked in that sweltering August morning. The marble floors were the same, the brass fixtures still polished to a mirror finish, but the energy in the air was different, lighter, more open. It was in the way tellers greeted customers without that quick sizing glance, and in the fact that the lobby now displayed a digital screen showing average wait times and daily transaction metrics for everyone to see. Transparency had gone from a whispered concept in corporate meetings to a visible, lived reality. Marcia had remained deeply involved in the process. She had joined the bank's Community Equity Council meeting monthly with executives to review data policy changes and feedback from local branches. The bias training she had proposed was no longer a pilot program, but a permanent fixture required for all new hires within their first 90 days, and for every employee annually thereafter. It wasn't just a slideshow and a quiz. It was interactive, built around real scenarios and anonymous case studies drawn from the bank's own history. People could see themselves in the stories, both in the role of the person harmed and in the role of the one making the harmful choice. However, the most striking shift was in the staff itself. Andre Coleman had been promoted to Director of Inclusion and Accountability, a role that didn't exist before the incident. His office now had the authority to halt or flag any policy or transaction that showed signs of inequitable treatment. As he explained it to Marcia one afternoon, "It's not just about catching mistakes. It's about building systems that make them harder to happen in the first place." It was a simple but powerful idea, like putting guardrails on a winding road before the accidents occur. Gerald Hughes's absence had been noticeable at first. He had spent months on administrative leave before quietly transitioning into a role within the bank's training division. Marcia had mixed feelings when she learned of it, but over time she saw the sense in it. He was now tasked with telling his own story, how he had let assumptions guide his judgment, and what it cost him professionally and personally. Hearing him speak about the incident to a room of new hires was awkward at first, but there was an undeniable honesty to it. The hardest thing, Gerald admitted during one session, is realizing you weren't protecting the bank, you were protecting your bias. Outside the bank, Marcia's own life had expanded. The scholarship fund she ran, bolstered by renewed financial support from the bank and other sponsors, had tripled its reach, offering aid to students in Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama. The application process now included financial literacy workshops for all participants, a condition she insisted on to ensure that every award was more than just a check. It was an investment in sustainable success. Jamal's career had continued to flourish, but the Billboard campaign had taken on a new meaning after the incident. The bank's marketing team, working with Marcia, had redesigned it entirely. This time, it wasn't just his face and a slogan. The new campaign featured real stories: a young entrepreneur who secured her first business loan, a retired veteran who refinanced his home without hidden fees, a single mother who used a small grant to start a catering company. Jamal appeared in the ads, but as a narrator telling the stories of others. "It's not about me," he said in one spot. "It's about all of us having the chance to be seen for who we really are." Marcia often thought about that word "seen." The original incident had been rooted in the opposite, in the refusal to see her beyond a set of assumptions. Now the changes within Peachtree Bank were built on the principle that everyone walking through the door should be met as an individual, not a stereotype. One brisk February afternoon, she returned to the Midtown branch for a scheduled meeting. Amanda, the young teller from that day, was now the branch's assistant manager. She greeted Marcia warmly, with the quiet pride of someone who had witnessed transformation firsthand. As they walked toward the conference room, Amanda said, "You know, I used to think nothing I saw here could change, but you proved me wrong." The meeting that day wasn't about resolving a crisis. It was about reviewing progress. Customer surveys showed a marked increase in satisfaction among minority clients. Transaction denial rates were down, and the branch had earned recognition from a national watchdog group for its equity practices. These were numbers, yes, but they told a human story, a story of fewer humiliations, fewer closed doors, and more chances given without prejudice. As the meeting wrapped, Diane Phillips turned to Marcia. "We've been thinking about making this council permanent. Change shouldn't be a reaction to a headline. It should be the way we operate." Marcia agreed. Justice isn't just about fixing what went wrong for one person. It's about building a place where the wrong can't happen so easily again. She knew that sentiment could sound lofty, but it was rooted in something very practical. If a bank could codify fairness into its operations, then fairness wasn't just a value. It was a process, a habit, a standard that could be measured and maintained. When she stepped outside, the winter sun was bright against the cold air. The current billboard showed Jamal in a gym with a group of kids, all laughing as they tried to dribble 2 basketballs at once. Beneath them, the words read, "We all have potential. Let's invest in it." Marcia smiled. Not because the bank had redeemed itself entirely. She knew that no institution was beyond error, but because she could see the trajectory and it was bending towards something better. The humiliation she had felt that August day had been real sharp enough to cut. But like many sharp things in her life, she had learned to turn it into a tool, one that could carve out space for change. And now, walking down Peachtree Street with the wind biting her cheeks, she felt something that was not pride exactly, and not relief, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that what began as a personal insult had become a public transformation. It was in every sense a new beginning. From the moment Marcia Taylor stepped into Peachtree Bank with a $50,000 check in hand, She had no idea she was walking into a defining moment of her life. What should have been a simple transaction turned into a scene of humiliation when branch supervisor Gerald Hughes, without proper verification, tore the check to pieces. The sound of the paper ripping through the quiet lobby was more than a physical act. It was a symbolic stripping of dignity fueled by an assumption that she, a black woman, couldn't possibly have earned such a sum legitimately. But fate has a way of folding irony into the most painful moments. Outside, just beyond the glass walls, workers unveiled a massive billboard for the bank's latest campaign. Staring down from that billboard was Jamal Taylor Marcia's son, NBA player philanthropist, and the centerpiece of Peachtree Bank's Investing in Our Future initiative. In an instant, the dynamic shifted. The same institution that publicly celebrated her family's contributions had just undermined her in its own lobby. When Regional Director Diane Phillips arrived, she greeted Marcia not as a stranger, but as a respected partner in the bank's community programs. The contrast between how Marcia was treated privately and the image the bank projected publicly was impossible to ignore. Yet Marcia did not seize the moment to seek revenge. Instead, she demanded structural change, calling for mandatory bias training, transparent transaction review processes, and quarterly audits to ensure fair treatment across all branches. Her focus wasn't just on her own dignity, but on preventing similar incidents for anyone who came after her. That choice to turn personal pain into collective progress was what transformed the story from a confrontation into a catalyst for reform. In the months that followed, Peachtree Bank implemented Marcia's recommendations. The training program became permanent. Every branch adopted transparent denial logs, and Andre Coleman was appointed as Director of Inclusion and Accountability, empowered to stop or review any potentially biased decision before it impacted a customer. Gerald Hughes, once the symbol of the bank's bias, was reassigned to the training division, where he shared his own experience and mistakes as part of the curriculum. Beyond the bank's walls, Marcia's influence expanded. Her scholarship fund tripled its reach, now touching students across 3 states. Jamal's Billboard campaign was redesigned to spotlight real community success stories, shifting the focus from celebrity endorsement to genuine human impact. The transformation was tangible. Customers walked into the bank without the shadow of suspicion hanging over them. Staff approached each transaction with consistency and respect. And for Marcia, there was a deep satisfaction in knowing that the humiliation she endured had been repurposed into a blueprint for equity. The lesson in her story is powerful moments of injustice, no matter how personal, can be the seeds of lasting change if we choose to confront them strategically. Injustice thrives when it is hidden, when victims feel too powerless or too exhausted to speak up. By confronting the issue, directly documenting it, and demanding systemic solutions, Marcia not only reclaimed her dignity, but also ensured the environment would be safer for those who followed. For each of us, the takeaway is clear. We all encounter moments when we're underestimated, dismissed, or judged unfairly. In those moments, the choice is ours to walk away quietly or to channel the experience into action that outlives the pain. This doesn't always mean grand public battles. Sometimes it's about asking the right questions, requesting transparency, or finding allies who will help push for change. Change rarely comes quickly, and it almost never comes without resistance. But as Marcia's journey shows, persistence, backed by a clear vision, can turn even the most humiliating moments into turning points. When we insist on fairness, not just for ourselves, but for everyone, we create ripple effects far beyond our own lives. If Marcia had left that day without speaking up, the policies would have stayed the same, the bias unchallenged, and the next customer might have faced the same disrespect. Instead, because she stood her ground, an entire institution had to reevaluate its values and its practices. Her story is a reminder that justice isn't about one dramatic win. It's about building systems where fairness becomes the norm, not the exception. And that work is something each of us can be part of in our own spheres of influence. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the power of speaking up and the impact of one person's resolve, then join us in keeping these conversations alive. Subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing powerful real stories that don't just inspire, but drive change. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating content that matters, content that just might spark the next big transformation.